Jessica Carter adjusted her tortoiseshell reading glasses, the soft glow of the computer screen illuminating the fine lines around her eyes. It was 5:45 a.m., and she'd been at her meticulously organized desk for 20 minutes already, a silent sentinel preparing the battlefield for Cameron Blackwell, the formidable CEO of Sterling Enterprises. 3 years she had held this position, a silent cog in his well-oiled machine, and her routine was as ingrained as the company logo. Arrive before him, arrange every detail with impeccable precision, anticipate potential disruptions before they even flickered on the horizon. The low hum of the coffee machine emanated from the small, sterile kitchenette adjacent to her workspace, a familiar soundtrack to her early mornings. She poured the dark, aromatic liquid into his preferred oversized mug, a chipped ceramic relic from his college days. Black coffee, no sugar, no cream, just a potent, bitter brew as uncompromising as the man himself. The files for his demanding 9 a.m. meeting were meticulously arranged in the precise order he preferred, each document a carefully chosen weapon in his corporate arsenal. Urgent emails had been deftly filtered, inconsequential matters dismissed, and responses drafted where appropriate, leaving only those thorny issues demanding his direct, laser-like focus. Jessica was undeniably exceptional at her job, a master of efficiency and foresight. The cruel irony was that Cameron Blackwell never seemed to truly see her. He treated her with a polite detachment, a piece of office furniture useful, even necessary, but ultimately invisible. At precisely 7 a.m., the elevator doors hissed open, and Cameron Blackwell strode into the office with an almost tangible aura of command. His presence was a force field, causing a ripple of hushed whispers amongst the female employees who populated the hallways. He was 36 years old, a towering 6'2", with broad shoulders that strained the impeccable tailoring of his custom Italian suits. His dark brown hair, always styled with a meticulous carelessness, framed sharp, chiseled features, a strong jawline hinting at unwavering resolve, a straight, aristocratic nose, and deep-set, espresso-colored eyes that seemed to constantly calculate, assessing every detail of the world around him. Jessica watched with practiced discretion as he moved with predatory grace directly towards his corner office, not even a fleeting glance in her direction. She stood poised, his steaming mug of coffee held at the ready. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice betraying none of the simmering resentment she carefully concealed. It was steady, professional, perfectly calibrated for his ears. Cameron paused almost imperceptibly. He took the mug without acknowledging her gaze, muttering a near-inaudible perfunctory "good morning," before disappearing into his glass-walled office. The door clicked shut behind him, a symbolic barrier. Jessica sighed quietly, a small sound swallowed by the hum of the office, and returned to her desk. 3 years of working side by side with this man, day in and day out, and he treated her as if she were part of the building's unglamorous infrastructure. The plumbing, the wiring, the HVAC system. Useful, utterly necessary, but ultimately invisible. She knew his preferred blend of ethically sourced Arabica beans. She knew he loathed meetings scheduled after 5 p.m., a fact she'd learned after a particularly brutal post-work debriefing. She knew he was deathly allergic to shellfish, which meant she religiously scrutinized restaurant menus before making any reservation, saving him from potential anaphylactic disaster. Jessica knew Cameron Blackwell better than almost anyone in this sprawling corporate empire, perhaps even better than his own estranged family. But to him, she was simply the efficient, tireless assistant who kept the gears of his life turning smoothly in the sterile, hermetically sealed environment of the executive penthouse. The morning unfolded with its usual frenetic pace. Jessica canceled a pointless meeting she knew he would despise, deftly rescheduling it for a more strategically advantageous time slot. She resolved a potentially damaging issue with a disgruntled supplier before Cameron even registered there was a problem, a silent firewall protecting him from corporate wildfires. She orchestrated the afternoon presentation for a group of demanding investors with the precision and attention to detail of a seasoned military strategist. When noon finally arrived, Cameron emerged from his office for the first time in hours, his eyes still glued to the hypnotic glow of his phone as he furiously typed a response. He didn't even bother to lift his gaze to meet hers. "Jessica, has the 2 p.m. meeting been confirmed?" he barked, his tone clipped and impatient. "Yes, sir. Confirmed. The conference room is fully prepared. All documents have been printed and are arranged on the main table, as per your instructions. I also ordered coffee and water. Mr. Thompson prefers green tea, so I've made arrangements for that as well," she responded, her voice a model of professional detachment. "Always anticipate, always deliver." As always, Cameron simply nodded curtly, his eyes still glued to the screen, offering no acknowledgement of her efforts. "Good. Cancel my lunch today. I'll grab something quick here and review the numbers before the meeting." He retreated back into his office before she had a chance to respond, the glass door clicking shut with a decisive finality. Jessica watched the door close once again, and felt that familiar, dull pang in her chest. It was a complicated cocktail of emotions, admiration mixed with simmering frustration, an unacknowledged attraction she would never dare voice aloud, mingled with a deep-seated sense of resignation. Cameron Blackwell was, without a doubt, the most physically attractive man she had ever encountered. But he was also the most emotionally reserved, the most aloof, and the most utterly oblivious to her existence as a flesh-and-blood human being. To him, Jessica was a function, a tool to be utilized, not a person to be acknowledged. She was the assistant who solved problems before they even manifested, not the woman who spent more waking hours with him than anyone else in his life. She had grown accustomed to it over time, or at least she had desperately tried to. She carefully tucked away her unrequited feelings into some deeply hidden corner of her heart, locking them away and focusing on performing her job to the absolute best of her considerable abilities. The afternoon passed in a dizzying blur of meetings, conference calls, and a never-ending stream of emails. At 7 in the evening, when the majority of the office drones had already escaped to their respective lives, Jessica was still chained to her desk, meticulously finalizing the quarterly report Cameron would need first thing the following morning. The light from her monitor cast a pale glow on her tired face. He emerged from his office, stopped beside her desk, and finally truly looked at her. "You're still here," he commented, his voice flat and expressionless. Jessica couldn't decipher whether it was a genuine question or a mere statement of fact. "I'm finishing the quarterly report. It will be ready for you first thing tomorrow morning," she replied, her fingers still flying across the keyboard. Cameron stood in silence for a moment, observing her with that unervingly analytical expression. For a fleeting fraction of a second, Jessica thought she detected something different in his gaze, a flicker of something almost human. But then he simply nodded, picked up the folder he needed, and said, "Don't stay too late," and promptly left, leaving Jessica alone in the echoing emptiness of the deserted office. Transparent as ever, February rolled around, bringing with it the characteristic saccharine energy that always permeated the air as Valentine's Day approached. The office was discreetly decorated with subtle touches of red and pink, a few strategically placed balloons, some heart-shaped confetti sprinkled on the reception desk. Conversations amongst coworkers revolved almost exclusively around romantic plans, anticipated gifts, and reservations at overpriced restaurants. Jessica observed the festivities with a mixture of weary resignation and polite indifference. For her, Valentine's Day would likely be like any other day: work, more work, and perhaps a lonely frozen pizza consumed in front of the flickering screen of some random streaming series. She expected nothing different. She had no boyfriend, no eager suitors, and certainly no romantic prospects even remotely on the horizon. Or at least, that was what she thought until a delivery arrived for her at the reception desk. "Jessica Carter?" the delivery person asked, holding aloft a large, extravagant arrangement of red and white roses. Jessica blinked, momentarily confused. "Yes, that's me," she responded hesitantly. The delivery person handed over the elaborate bouquet with a knowing smile. "Someone's lucky. Happy early Valentine's Day." Jessica carried the fragrant arrangement back to her desk, feeling the collective gaze of her curious coworkers burning into her back. The flowers were undeniably beautiful, clearly expensive, and came with a small, elegant card. She opened it with trembling fingers and read the handwritten message. To the most intelligent and interesting woman I have met in months. I hope to see you soon, Derek. Jessica felt her face flush with heat. Derek Martinez. She had met him 3 weeks ago at a corporate event where she accompanied Cameron. A tedious evening of networking and forced smiles. Derek was a charismatic entrepreneur, the owner of a successful startup, and had spent a surprising amount of time engaged in conversation with her while Cameron was preoccupied with schmoozing potential investors. He had been charming, attentive, and seemingly genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions, not just her ability to anticipate Cameron's every need. But Jessica hadn't expected him to actually make a move. Wow, Jessica! Who sent those gorgeous flowers? Natalie from accounting appeared beside her desk, her eyes wide with animated curiosity. A friend, Jessica stammered, still trying to process the situation. Soon, other coworkers had gathered around, peppering her with questions, exchanging excited giggles, creating the predictable office commotion that Jessica usually avoided. She tried to answer their questions politely, all the while attempting to arrange the overflowing bouquet in a corner of her desk. But her attention was suddenly captured by a subtle movement behind the glass wall of Cameron's office. He was standing perfectly still, looking directly at the scene unfolding around her desk. His face was unreadable, a carefully constructed mask of neutrality, but there was something in his posture, in the way his fingers were clenched tightly around the pen he was holding, that seemed different. Jessica quickly averted her gaze, feeling a strange, almost imperceptible chill run down her spine. The next day, another delivery arrived. This time, it was a lavish box of imported Belgian chocolates, each piece individually wrapped in gold foil, accompanied by another card from Derek. The coworkers made even more of a fuss, their curiosity reaching fever pitch. Jessica was simultaneously flattered and deeply embarrassed by all the unwanted attention. She wasn't accustomed to being the center of attention, especially not for romantic reasons. When she returned from lunch, she discovered a third, even more extravagant surprise awaiting her. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, her name written across the front in elegant, flowing calligraphy. Inside was a formal invitation to dinner at Le Bernardin, one of the most exclusive and impossibly expensive restaurants in the entire city, the reservation meticulously secured for Valentine's Day. Jessica, you have to accept. Natalie practically shrieked when Jessica reluctantly showed her the invitation. Le Bernardin, do you have any idea how utterly impossible it is to get a reservation there? This guy is seriously interested. Jessica smiled, feeling a flutter of nervous excitement in her stomach. Maybe, just maybe, this Valentine's Day wouldn't be so painfully ordinary after all. What Jessica didn't see was Cameron Blackwell observing everything from the sterile confines of his office. He had a perfect, unobstructed view of her desk through the transparent glass wall that separated their worlds. And over the past 2 days, he had noticed that he had been spending an inordinate amount of time looking in that direction, his gaze inexplicably drawn to her. Each delivery, each genuine smile that graced her face, each shared laugh with her coworkers seemed to poke at something deep and uncomfortable inside his chest. Cameron Blackwell was not a man accustomed to experiencing emotional discomfort. He had meticulously constructed his entire life around control, cold logic, and ruthless efficiency. Feelings were unnecessary distractions, messy complications to be avoided at all costs, especially feelings related to his employees. But when he saw Jessica read that invitation, when he saw the genuine, unadulterated smile illuminate her face in a way he had never witnessed before, something inside him subtly fractured. Jealousy. It was jealousy he was feeling. Raw, primitive, irrational, and utterly uncontrollable jealousy. He imagined some shallow, insipid idiot taking Jessica to dinner, making her laugh with inane jokes, holding her hand possessively across the white tablecloth, looking into those surprisingly expressive eyes that he had never truly noticed until now. The image sent a sickening lurch through his stomach. Cameron abruptly released the pen he had been gripping so tightly, the expensive writing instrument bouncing harmlessly on the polished surface of his desk. How could he have been so blind? Jessica had been working for him for years, a constant, reliable presence in his often chaotic world. He saw her every single day, entrusted her with every intricate aspect of his professional life, depended on her in ways he had never depended on anyone else. And only now, seeing another man actively interested in her, did he finally see her, truly see her, for the first time. He saw the sharp, incisive intelligence that he had previously taken for granted. He saw the quiet competence, the understated beauty that had always been there, subtly radiating beneath the surface, but that he had completely and unforgivably ignored. He noticed the way she bit her lower lip when she was deeply concentrating, a habit he suddenly found inexplicably endearing. He saw the small, almost imperceptible dimple that appeared on her left cheek when she smiled, a fleeting flash of genuine joy. He noted the graceful way she moved through the office, a silent ballet of efficiency and understated elegance. "Mr. Blackwell?" Jessica's voice crackled through the intercom, pulling him abruptly from his unwelcome reverie. "Yes," he responded, his voice sounding harsher and more strained than he had intended. "You have a call from headquarters. It's urgent." Cameron took a deep, steadying breath, desperately trying to regain his carefully constructed composure. "Put it through." He answered the call, mechanically discussing quarterly numbers and strategic partnerships, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in a relentless loop of unwanted thoughts. It was focused on that extravagant invitation lying on Jessica's desk. It was consumed by the genuine smile he had seen on her face. It was tormented by the terrifying realization that he had been blind for far too long to something that now seemed achingly, painfully obvious. When he hung up the phone, he looked again through the glass window that separated their worlds. Jessica was working diligently, her brow furrowed in concentration as she stared intently at her computer screen, seemingly oblivious to the emotional turmoil she had unwittingly provoked inside him. Cameron rubbed his face wearily with his hands, momentarily messing up his impeccably styled hairstyle for perhaps the first time in years. He was in trouble. Big trouble. Cameron stared blankly at the digital clock on his car dashboard. 7:15 p.m. Jessica was probably already at the restaurant, or perhaps she was still at home, meticulously getting ready for her date, agonizing over choosing the perfect dress, carefully applying her perfume, preparing to impress that insufferable idiot, Derek. He gripped the steering wheel with unnecessary force, his knuckles turning white, and abruptly turned the car towards his lavish penthouse apartment. He had canceled all of his evening commitments with vague, unconvincing excuses that had clearly left his usually unflappable secretary confused. Cameron Blackwell never canceled business commitments. Never. But the mere idea of sitting through a tedious corporate dinner, feigning interest in empty conversations while Jessica was enjoying a romantic date with another man, was simply impossible. He would rather surgically remove his own arm. The penthouse was silent and eerily empty when he arrived. Cameron immediately loosened his tie, impatiently removed his expensive tailored jacket, and went straight to the bar. He poured 3 fingers of amber-colored Scotch whiskey into a heavy crystal glass and took a large, fortifying sip. Feeling the burning liquid sear its way down his throat, he looked around the minimalist and absurdly expensive apartment he called home. Everything was perfectly curated, modern, impeccably clean, and utterly soul-crushingly empty. Stark white walls, designer furniture carefully chosen to project an image of sophisticated wealth, expensive works of art that he had never truly appreciated. It was, he realized with a jolt of unwelcome clarity, a sterile reflection of the rest of his existence, functional, efficient, and utterly lifeless. Cameron walked to the enormous window overlooking the glittering expanse of the illuminated city below and took another slow sip of the whiskey. 7:30 p.m. They must be at the restaurant by now. Derek had probably pulled out the chair for Jessica with that practiced, charmingly fake smile that reeked of insincerity. He had undoubtedly ordered an expensive bottle of wine, carefully chosen to impress her with his discerning taste and extravagant spending habits. He was probably looking at her with that adoring, possessive gaze, making her feel as if she were the only woman in the entire world. The vivid image sent a surge of bile rising in Cameron's throat. He gripped the heavy crystal glass so tightly that he was afraid it might shatter in his hand. He imagined Derek casually touching Jessica's hand across the linen-covered table, making her laugh with some unfunny, self-deprecating joke, leaning in a little too close while whispering something suggestive in her ear. He imagined Jessica smiling back at him that same way he had seen her smile when she read the dinner invitation. He imagined her eyes sparkling under the warm glow of the restaurant's candlelight. The relentless mental torture was almost unbearable. Cameron poured himself another generous measure of whiskey, something he rarely did. He was not a man who typically drank alone, not a man who willingly relinquished control. But tonight, the iron-fisted control he had cultivated his entire life was hanging precariously by a ridiculously thin thread. He sank heavily onto the Italian leather sofa and let his head fall back against the cool surface, closing his eyes tightly. But closing his eyes only served to make everything worse because then the unwanted images became even more vivid, more intrusive, more painfully real. He saw Derek placing his hand possessively on Jessica's waist as they walked out of the elegant restaurant, the cool night air nipping at their cheeks. He saw him pressing Jessica gently against her car, leaning in slowly, capturing her soft lips in a lingering, passionate kiss. Cameron opened his eyes abruptly, his heart pounding erratically in his chest. "What the hell?" he muttered to the empty apartment, rubbing his face roughly with his hands. How did he let this happen? How did he let another man get there first? The answer was obvious and undeniably pathetic. Because he had been a blind, arrogant idiot who had treated Jessica like an inanimate piece of office furniture, a faceless cog in his corporate machine. She had been there all along, being exceptional, being dedicated, being everything he didn't deserve. And he had simply ignored her, utterly oblivious, until he saw another man finally giving her the attention and appreciation she had always deserved. Cameron stood up and began pacing restlessly back and forth across the expansive living room, the whiskey glass still clutched tightly in his hand. His mind, normally trained for precise analyses and calculated decisions, was now trapped in an obsessive, self-destructive loop of increasingly worse scenarios. 10 p.m. Dinner was probably over by now. Derek was taking Jessica home, or perhaps somewhere else, perhaps to his place. The mere thought sent a wave of something akin to blind panic washing over Cameron. Meanwhile, Jessica sat across from Derek at Le Bernardin, increasingly regretting her impulsive decision to accept his invitation. The restaurant was undeniably stunning, a temple of culinary perfection with crystal chandeliers casting a soft glow on the impeccably dressed clientele, pristine white tablecloths stretching as far as the eye could see, and artful arrangements of fresh flowers adorning every corner. But the company, unfortunately, left much to be desired. Derek had spent the first 20 minutes of the excruciatingly long evening talking almost exclusively about himself, his impressive business deals, his exotic travels, his incredibly important connections. Every time Jessica attempted to contribute something about herself, about her life, about her work, Derek somehow found a way to skillfully redirect the conversation back to himself, effectively silencing her. "That reminds me of when I was in Tokyo," he interrupted dismissively when Jessica began to describe an interesting project she was currently working on at the office. "I closed an incredible deal there. The people I met were absolutely fascinating." Jessica took a small sip of her wine, her initial enthusiasm beginning to rapidly fade. When the first course finally arrived, the waiter accidentally bumped Derek's chair ever so lightly while carefully placing the plate on the table. "Dude, can you be more careful?" Derek snapped irritably, his voice dripping with condescension. "I apologize, sir," the waiter murmured, visibly embarrassed by the outburst. Jessica felt her stomach tighten with discomfort. The way Derek had looked at the waiter, as if he were somehow inherently inferior, left a distinctly bitter taste in her mouth that had absolutely nothing to do with the food. "It was an accident, Derek," she said softly, hoping to diffuse the situation. He shrugged dismissively. "It's his job not to bump into people. If he can't do it right, he should find another job." The callous phrase dropped like a heavy stone in Jessica's stomach. The rest of the night continued in a steady downward spiral. Between courses, Derek made a series of increasingly offensive and outdated comments about how women somehow looked prettier when they allowed men to take care of them financially, and how the real problem with women in the corporate world was that they got far too stressed out and simply needed to learn to relax more. Each patronizing word was like a scratch on the carefully constructed romantic fantasy Jessica had foolishly allowed herself to build in her head. By the time dessert arrived, she was silently counting the minutes until she could politely escape this disastrous date. "You know, Jessica," Derek said, leaning across the table with that same practiced smile she had initially found so charming, but that now seemed smug and vaguely predatory. "You're different from the others. Smart, beautiful, and undeniably hardworking. But you don't need to kill yourself at that demanding job. With the right guy by your side, you could have a much easier and far more fulfilling life." Jessica forced a polite smile. "I actually like my work." He laughed dismissively. "Sure, they all say that, but admit it, Jessica. It would be so much better not having to deal with an annoying boss every single day." Asterisk annoying boss? Asterisk Jessica thought, the words echoing in her mind. No, Cameron was many things, distant, reserved, and undeniably demanding without a doubt. But he had never disrespected her, never underestimated her professionally, and had certainly never suggested that she needed a man in order to have a better life. Suddenly, the stark comparison between Derek and Cameron became painfully clear, and Derek lost spectacularly. "My boss is complicated, but he's also extremely respectful," she responded diplomatically, carefully choosing her words. Derek rolled his eyes dismissively. "Ah, that whole girl boss thing. Always defending the boss. Relax, Jessica, it's just a job. You're so much more than that." The condescending tone was the final straw. Jessica carefully placed her linen napkin on the table. "It's been a very interesting evening, Derek, but it's getting late. I really need to go." He seemed genuinely surprised, even slightly offended. "Already? I thought we could have another drink. Maybe go somewhere a little more private." The suggestive smile that spread across his face made Jessica want to run screaming from the restaurant. "No, thank you. I have to be at work early tomorrow," she said firmly, her tone brooking no argument. The awkward walk to her car felt like an eternity, with Derek persistently trying to hold her hand and Jessica politely, but firmly, dodging his unwanted advances. When she finally said a hasty goodbye and slid gratefully into her car, Jessica released a long, shuddering sigh of relief and profound disappointment. The fantasy was officially over, and the cold, hard reality was that her supposed Prince Charming was just another self-absorbed, egocentric, condescending man. She drove home in silence, feeling utterly foolish for having allowed herself to create such unrealistic expectations. Monday morning, Jessica arrived at the office with a heavy heart. Derek had sent 3 increasingly persistent text messages over the weekend, desperately wanting to go out again. She still hadn't figured out how to politely refuse without resorting to outright rudeness. She was so preoccupied with her thoughts that she almost spilled Cameron's meticulously prepared coffee when he unexpectedly arrived at her desk. "Good morning," he said, and Jessica blinked in genuine surprise. Cameron was actually looking at her, really looking at her, not just in her general direction while his mind was clearly focused on a million other more important things. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwell. How was your weekend?" she asked, the question slipping out almost unconsciously, and Jessica almost dropped the coffee again. Cameron had never asked about her weekend before. "Interesting," he responded cautiously, observing her face with an unnerving level of attention that made Jessica feel oddly exposed. "Interesting good or interesting complicated?" The unexpected question was so disarming that Jessica let out a nervous, slightly awkward laugh. "A little bit of both, actually." Cameron was silent for a moment, then did something that left Jessica completely and utterly shocked. He smiled. It wasn't a big, toothy grin, just a slight, almost imperceptible curve of his lips, but it was undeniably a genuine smile, the first time she had seen Cameron Blackwell smile for real. "I understand the feeling," he said softly, his voice lower and more intimate than she had ever heard it before. Then, he actually took the coffee cup from her hands, his fingers briefly brushing against hers in a fleeting moment of physical contact that sent a jolt of unexpected electricity through her entire body. "Thank you for the coffee, Jessica. It's perfect as always." He turned and walked into his office, leaving Jessica standing frozen in place, staring blankly at her own hands, still feeling the lingering phantom sensation of his brief touch. What just happened? Throughout the rest of the day, the strangeness continued. Cameron actively sought out her opinion on a particularly complex presentation, something he had never done before. At lunchtime, he appeared at her desk with 2 steaming cups of coffee. "I thought you might need this," he said, placing a cup in front of her with an uncharacteristic hint of concern. "You look tired." Jessica accepted the coffee wordlessly, completely bewildered by his unprecedented behavior. Who was this man, and what had he done with the real Cameron Blackwell? Later, when she was meticulously organizing a stack of files, she felt eyes on her. She glanced up and found Cameron watching her intently through the glass wall of his office. When their eyes met, he didn't immediately look away, as he invariably would have done before. Instead, he held her gaze for a long, drawn-out moment, 1 to 3 heart-stopping seconds, before finally turning back to his computer. Jessica felt her heart accelerate at an alarming rate, a physical response that had absolutely nothing to do with Derek and everything to do with the disconcerting change in the behavior of the man she secretly admired from afar. That afternoon, Cameron appeared at her desk with a decidedly concerned expression etched on his face. "Jessica, we have a problem," he said, and she immediately shifted into professional mode, her mind racing to anticipate the potential crisis. "What happened?" He rubbed the back of his neck wearily, a telltale stress gesture she had unconsciously learned to recognize over the years. "The presentation for the Japanese investors is tomorrow, and I just discovered that half of the data is completely wrong. Apparently, someone on the team used outdated numbers." Jessica was already standing, reaching for her tablet. "How much time do we have?" Cameron checked his expensive watch. "They arrive at 9 a.m. in the morning. It's 6 p.m. now. 15 hours. Jessica did some quick mental calculations. "I can redo the presentation if you give me the correct numbers. It'll take all night, but there's just enough time." Cameron hesitated, a flicker of something akin to guilt crossing his features. "Jessica, I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking, I'm offering," she interrupted firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. "This contract is far too important to risk." The look he gave her then was one of profound gratitude, mixed with something deeper, something she couldn't quite decipher. "Okay," he said softly, his voice strangely husky. "Let's do it together then. Order some food and plenty of coffee. It's going to be a long night." By 8 p.m., the office was completely deserted except for the 2 of them. Empty Chinese food containers were scattered haphazardly across the polished surface of the conference table where they worked side by side, surrounded by a chaotic mess of papers, laptops, and 3 already empty coffee pots. The air was thick with the mingled sense of stale takeout, printer ink, and lingering anticipation. "This graph right here," Jessica pointed at the screen, leaning slightly forward. Cameron moved closer to see better, his shoulder brushing almost imperceptibly against hers. Neither of them moved away. "You're right. Let's change the scale," he murmured, his voice so close that Jessica could feel the warmth of his breath gently caressing her neck. She swallowed hard, desperately trying to maintain her focus on the task at hand. The hours passed in a blur of concentrated work, fueled by caffeine and a growing sense of unease. Each accidental touch of hands when passing documents seemed to linger a second longer than necessary. Every time Cameron leaned over her shoulder to examine the screen, he stayed a little bit closer, his body heat radiating against her back. Every time Jessica turned to ask a question, their faces were dangerously, tantalizingly close. Midnight arrived, and the presentation was almost ready, the final touches meticulously being added. Jessica stretched languidly, rolling her tense and aching shoulders. "Tired?" Cameron asked, watching her with an unreadable expression. "A little, but we're almost done," she replied, forcing a smile. He stood up silently, walked until he was standing directly behind her. And before Jessica could even begin to process what was happening, he gently placed his hands on her shoulders. "You're tense," he said softly, beginning to massage the tight, knotted muscles. Jessica froze, every nerve ending in her body suddenly on high alert. Cameron's hands were firm, skilled, and completely, irrevocably crossing the unspoken line of professional conduct. She knew she should stop this, should pull away, should say something, anything, to diffuse the escalating tension. But instead, she let out an involuntary sigh of relief as he untied a particularly painful knot. "Relax, Jessica," Cameron murmured, his voice now undeniably husky and laced with an unfamiliar emotion. "You worked hard today." Jessica closed her eyes, allowing herself to savor the moment. His hands moved slowly from her shoulders to the base of her neck, his thumbs making small, soothing circles that were simultaneously relaxing and incredibly exciting. Her breathing became shallow and irregular. "Cameron," she whispered his name, the sound barely audible. It was the first time she had ever said his first name out loud, and the unfamiliar sound of it hung in the air between them. He stopped immediately, his hands remaining lightly on her shoulders. Jessica slowly turned her chair, looking up at him. Cameron was looking down at her with an intensity that made her heart race uncontrollably. His dark brown eyes were even darker than usual, his breathing clearly affected. For a long, charged moment, neither of them moved, trapped in a silent, unspoken dialogue. Then Cameron slowly raised his hand, as if in a trance, and gently touched her face. His fingertips slid along her jawline, his thumb grazing lightly across her lower lip. Jessica could barely breathe. "Jessica," he said, his voice rough with barely suppressed emotion. "If you want me to stop, you need to tell me now." Instead of responding with words, Jessica stood up slowly, closing the remaining space between them. She was now so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the subtle nuances in his dark, mesmerizing eyes, count each shallow, irregular breath he took. Cameron slid his hand from her face to the back of her neck, gently pulling her closer. The warmth of his hand grazed the nape of her neck, a subtle caress that sent shivers down her spine. His fingers then daringly intertwined themselves within the silken strands of her hair, creating an intoxicating dance of touch. He leaned in slowly, deliberately, offering her ample opportunity to retreat, to break the spell that was weaving itself around them. But Jessica remained steadfast, rooted to the spot. The air crackled with anticipation as their lips hovered mere inches apart. She could feel his warm breath mingling with hers, a tantalizing invitation. Every fiber of her being screamed, begged, for her to close the impossible distance that separated them, to surrender to the magnetic pull that had taken hold. Just then, the jarring shrill of the desk phone shattered the delicate moment, ripping them from their intoxicating trance. They both recoiled as if struck by an electric current. Cameron, his voice now tight with barely suppressed tension, answered the intrusive call. Jessica stumbled away, her heart hammering against her ribs with such ferocity that she was convinced he could hear its frantic rhythm. What had almost happened? What were they on the verge of doing? The question echoed in her mind, a mixture of fear and exhilarating anticipation. Cameron finished the call, running a weary hand over his face. It was just security making their routine rounds, he explained, his voice still a little rough around the edges. They stood there, separated by the vast expanse of the conference table, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. The energy, still charged with the electricity of the almost kiss, thrummed between them. "We should finish the presentation," he began, his voice a touch hesitant. "No," Jessica interjected, the word escaping her lips before she could fully process it. She didn't trust herself to hear whatever he was about to say, afraid it would break the spell or worse, confirm her deepest desires were nothing more than wishful thinking. Cameron nodded slowly, his gaze intense. Yes, the presentation. They forced themselves back to work, but everything had irrevocably changed. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken emotions. Each glance now carried a weight of meaning, each silence filled with unspoken desires. Every casual movement was hyper-aware of the other's presence. The air crackled with a palpable tension that made it difficult to concentrate. As the hands of the clock crept toward 3 a.m., the presentation was finally complete. Impeccable, polished, and primed to impress the potential investors. Jessica leaned back in her chair, exhaustion etched on her face as she saved the final version. "We did it," she sighed, the words a mixture of relief and lingering nervousness. Cameron was watching her, his gaze once again filled with that unnerving intensity. "You are incredible, you know that?" The compliment, coming from him after the charged atmosphere of the evening, was almost too much to bear. Jessica felt tears prick at her eyes, a combination of exhaustion, raw emotion, and the bewildering confusion of what was unfolding between them. "I should go home," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Cameron nodded, his eyes searching hers. "Let me drive you." "You don't need to, Cameron," Jessica protested weakly. "It's 3 o'clock in the morning. Let me take you home." His tone left no room for argument. The drive to Jessica's apartment was shrouded in silence, a silence pregnant with anticipation. When Cameron pulled up in front of her building, neither of them made a move to get out of the car. The engine idled softly, filling the small space with a low hum that only amplified the tension between them. "About what almost happened," Cameron began, his hands still gripping the steering wheel tightly. Jessica turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What almost happened, Cameron?" He finally turned to face her, and in the dim glow of the streetlights, she could see a vulnerability in his eyes that she had never witnessed before. "I almost kissed you," he confessed, his voice raw with honesty. "And if that phone hadn't rung, I would have. And I wouldn't have stopped at just a kiss." The raw honesty stole Jessica's breath away. "And now?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible. "What do we do now?" Cameron reached across the console and gently took her hand. "Now I stop being a coward. Now I tell you that I've been an absolute fool for 3 years. I've been so focused on keeping everything compartmentalized, on maintaining control, that I completely missed what was right in front of me." Jessica felt tears welling in her eyes. "Cameron, I don't understand. 2 weeks ago you barely looked at me." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a tender kiss to her knuckles. "I know, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But seeing those flowers on your desk, seeing another man recognize what I was too blind to see, it woke me up. Jessica, you're not just my assistant. You've never been just my assistant. You're the person I trust most in this world. You're brilliant, compassionate, and beautiful. And I've wasted so much time not telling you that." A single tear escaped and traced a path down Jessica's cheek. "What about work? What about professionalism?" Cameron gently wiped the tear away with his thumb. "I'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. All I know is that I can't go another day pretending you're invisible to me when you're the only person I truly see." Jessica searched his face, desperately looking for any sign of doubt, any hint of insincerity, but found only unwavering sincerity and a burning desire. "Then stop pretending," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Cameron leaned across the console, cupping her face in both hands. "May I kiss you now? No interruptions this time, just us." Instead of answering, Jessica closed the remaining distance between them, her heart soaring with a mixture of trepidation and unbridled hope. When their lips finally met, it felt like coming home. The kiss started soft, tentative, Cameron holding her face as if she were something precious, something fragile that could shatter with the slightest misstep. But then Jessica's hand slid up his chest, feeling the taut muscles beneath his shirt, and something within her broke loose. The kiss deepened, became more urgent, more demanding. Cameron pulled her closer, maneuvering around the awkward space of the car console, and Jessica felt every inch of his solid masculinity pressed against her. She opened her mouth, allowing his tongue to find hers in a dance that sent shivers down her spine and made her knees weak, even though she was already sitting down. When they finally broke apart, Both were breathless, their lungs struggling to catch up. Cameron rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. "I've waited so long for this," he murmured, his voice husky with emotion. "I wasted so much time being a blind idiot." Jessica laughed softly, still dizzy from the intensity of the kiss. Better late than never. He kissed her again, softer this time, savoring the moment, exploring the contours of her lips with a newfound tenderness. When they separated again, there was a promise in his eyes, a promise of more, of something real, of possibilities that left Jessica simultaneously thrilled and terrified. "I should let you go get some rest," Cameron said reluctantly, his hands still intertwined with hers. "We both have a big presentation in a few hours." Jessica nodded, but made no move to leave the car. "Cameron, what happens Monday at the office?" The question hung heavy in the air, filled with uncertainty and unspoken fears. He squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her skin. "Monday, we'll figure it out together. But Jessica, I want you to know that this is real for me. This isn't some fleeting thing, some momentary lapse in judgment. I want to do this right." Jessica smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that chased away the last vestiges of doubt. "Okay, we'll figure it out together." She finally opened the car door, but before stepping out, she leaned back in and kissed him once more. A quick, sweet kiss that sealed their unspoken promise. "Good luck with the presentation. You're going to be amazing." "We are going to be amazing," he corrected gently, a hint of possessiveness in his voice. "It's our presentation." Jessica walked towards her building entrance, turning back to wave as she reached the door. Cameron waited until she was safely inside before driving away, his mind already racing with possibilities. As she rode the elevator up to her apartment, Jessica couldn't stop smiling. Everything had changed in the span of one night, and she couldn't wait to see what the future held. The presentation the next morning was a resounding success. The Japanese investors were thoroughly impressed, and by noon, the contract was signed. Cameron caught Jessica's eye across the conference room and winked, a gesture so out of character that she had to suppress a laugh. The following Monday morning, Jessica arrived at the office with butterflies fluttering in her stomach. She had no idea how they would navigate their new relationship in the professional environment, how they would balance their personal feelings with the demands of their careers. The answer came when Cameron arrived at 7 a.m. But this time, instead of walking straight to his office, he stopped at her desk. He glanced around quickly to make sure they were alone, then leaned down and placed a soft, quick kiss on her lips, a silent declaration of his intentions. "Good morning," he said with a smile that reached his eyes. Jessica felt her cheeks flush, a mixture of embarrassment and pure, unadulterated joy. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwell." "Cameron," he corrected gently, his voice a low murmur. "When it's just us, call me Cameron." Over the next few weeks, they navigated their relationship with a careful balance, walking a tightrope between their personal feelings and professional responsibilities. At work, they maintained a facade of professionalism, careful to avoid any outward displays of affection. Though anyone paying close attention might notice the softer way Cameron spoke to Jessica, the way his eyes lingered on her just a moment too long, the way he found excuses to work closely with her, their secret was safe, at least for now. The unwanted advances from Dererick, thankfully, had finally ceased. After Jessica sent him a firm but polite message explaining that she wasn't interested, she blocked his number and never looked back. One evening, about a month after their first real kiss, Cameron asked Jessica to stay late, his request sending a shiver of anticipation down her spine. When the office had emptied and the last of their colleagues had departed, he came to her desk with a serious expression on his face, his brow furrowed with concern. "Jessica, we need to talk," he said, the words hanging heavy in the air. Her heart sank. "Those 4 words never mean anything good," she said cautiously, bracing herself for the worst. "Okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Cameron perched on the edge of her desk, his gaze fixed on hers. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about how we navigate this relationship given our work dynamic. I want to make sure we're doing this right, that we're not jeopardizing either of our careers. Jessica felt her stomach twist into a knot. Was he ending things? Was this all too complicated? Too difficult to manage? Are you ending this? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. What? No. He said quickly, reaching out and taking her hands in his. No, absolutely not. The opposite, actually. Jessica's eyes widened, her heart skipping a beat. The opposite? Cameron nodded, his grip tightening on her hands. Jessica, I want to do this right. I've spoken with HR and the board. I want to be transparent about our relationship. I don't want to hide you or what we have, but I also want to make sure you're protected. Jessica's eyes widened, her mind struggling to comprehend what he was saying. You told them? Cameron nodded, his expression earnest. I'm not going to hide you or what we have, but I also want to make sure you're protected. HR is going to work with us to ensure there are no conflicts of interest. And I want to make sure you know that your position, your career, is secure regardless of what happens between us personally. Tears welled in Jessica's eyes, blurring her vision. You did that for me? She whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He cupped her face gently, his thumbs wiping away the tears that streamed down her cheeks. Jessica, I would do anything for you. These past few weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. I'm not going to mess this up by being careless or by letting anyone think you haven't earned every bit of your success. Jessica threw her arms around his neck, holding him tight, burying her face in his shoulder. I love you, she whispered, the words escaping her lips without conscious thought. Cameron pulled back slightly to look at her, his eyes shining with an emotion that mirrored her own. You do? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I think I've loved you for a long time. I just never thought you would see me. He kissed her deeply, pouring all his pent-up emotions into the kiss. A silent promise of a future filled with love and devotion. I see you now, Jessica. I see you, and I love you, too. I'm sorry it took me so long. They stood there in the empty office, holding each other close, two people who had been invisible to each other for so long, now finally seeing clearly, their hearts intertwined, their futures irrevocably linked. 6 months later, Cameron took Jessica back to the very spot where they had shared their first real kiss, on that moonlit walk after meeting his friends. Under the same twinkling city lights, he got down on one knee, his heart pounding in his chest, and presented her with a ring that sparkled almost as brightly as her tears of joy. Jessica Carter, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Will you marry me? Jessica said yes without hesitation, the word a joyous exclamation that echoed through the night. At their wedding a year later, surrounded by their friends and family, Cameron gave a speech that had everyone in tears. He spoke about how easy it is to overlook the most important things in life when you're focused on the wrong priorities, how easily we can become blinded by ambition and success. He talked about how a simple bouquet of flowers on Valentine's Day had shaken him awake, forcing him to confront the truth he had been so desperately trying to ignore. He talked about how jealousy had been the uncomfortable catalyst that forced him to finally see what had been in front of him all along. But most importantly, he said, turning to look directly at Jessica, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. I learned that love doesn't always announce itself with fanfare, with grand gestures or dramatic pronouncements. Sometimes it's been there quietly, patiently, waiting for you to open your eyes, to look beyond the surface and see the beauty that lies beneath. Jessica was never invisible, he continued, his voice cracking with emotion. I was just blind, and I thank God every day that I finally learned to see. Jessica stood and walked to him, taking the microphone from his hand. And I learned, she said, her voice trembling slightly, that sometimes the person you've been waiting for has been right there all along, just waiting for you to notice them. Sometimes, she added, glancing at Cameron with a mischievous glint in her eyes, he's the difficult boss who challenges you, who pushes you to be better, who sees your potential even when he can't see his own feelings. Sometimes, she concluded, her voice filled with emotion, love isn't about being swept off your feet in a whirlwind romance. It's about building something real, something lasting, with someone who truly sees you, someone who appreciates you for who you are, flaws and all. They kissed, a long, tender kiss that sealed their vows, as their friends and family erupted in applause, celebrating the union of two people who had found each other in the most unexpected way, who had learned that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about love at first sight, but about finally opening your eyes to see what was always there. Years later, when people asked how they met, Cameron would smile, a hint of self-deprecating humor in his voice, and say, "She worked for me for 3 years, and I was too stupid to notice her. I was completely oblivious to the amazing woman who was right under my nose." Then he would add, with a touch of playful exasperation, "Then someone sent her flowers on Valentine's Day, and I realized I was about to lose the best thing that ever happened to me." And Jessica would chime in, laughing, her eyes sparkling with love and amusement. "He went from never looking at me to never letting me out of his sight. He became completely and wonderfully obsessed." But the truth was far simpler and more profound than any anecdote could ever capture. They had found each other not because of grand gestures or perfect timing, but because when the moment came to choose between comfort and courage, between blindness and sight, between the familiar and the real, they both chose to finally see each other clearly, to shed their inhibitions and embrace the vulnerability of love. And in that seeing, in that mutual recognition of worth and love and partnership, they found not just romance, but home, a place where they could be their true selves, where they were cherished and supported, where they could face the world together hand in hand. Jessica Carter had spent 3 years being invisible to her millionaire boss, but she spent the rest of her life being the only person Cameron Blackwell truly saw, the only person who truly mattered. And that, in the end, made all the difference. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to click like, share this story with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more meaningful stories.